My name is Maya Callahan. I'm 33 years old. And for 4 years, my own sister made sure that everyone I loved, my husband, my in-laws, my parents, believed I was a liar and a cheater. She fabricated an affair down to the hotel name. She fed it to my husband piece by piece over months, with the patience of someone who had a plan. And then, while my marriage was collapsing, while I was losing my home and my family in the same month, she was the one sitting on my mother's couch being called brave for coming forward. I didn't find out the truth for 4 years. And the only reason I found out at all is because she got sloppy. She left a paper trail on a tablet she forgot existed. 2 years of messages. Every fabricated detail. Every calculated move. And the one line I will never unhear, written in her own words to her friend, "She'll fall apart. She always does. And I'll be there." This is that story. But before I go on, if anything I've said in the last 60 seconds already feels familiar to you, if you've ever been erased from your own life by someone who was supposed to love you, hit like and subscribe. Not as a reflex, only if you genuinely connect with what you're hearing. And drop your city and your local time in the comments. I always read them. There's something about knowing where people are when they find this story that matters to me. Now, let's go back to the beginning. I want to tell you about the life I had before it fell apart, because I think that part gets skipped too often in stories like this. People want to get to the betrayal. I understand that. But if you don't know what I had, you won't understand what was taken. I was 29 when my world came apart. Daniel and I had been married for 2 years and together for 4. We met the unglamorous way, through a mutual friend at a birthday dinner where neither of us particularly wanted to be. He was quieter than I expected for someone who filled a room the way he did. I remember thinking he was the kind of person who only spoke when he had something worth saying. That turned out to be true, for better and worse. We were not a perfect couple. I want to be clear about that. We argued about money and about the way he shut down during conflict and about whose turn it was to deal with the landlord before we bought the house. We had a stretch in year 2 of dating where we almost didn't make it. A bad season of long hours and poor communication, and both of us quietly wondering if we were right for each other. We made it through. We chose each other on the other side of that. That mattered to me. It still does, in the complicated way that things can matter even after they're gone. The house was Daniel's dream more than mine, if I'm honest. A 1940s craftsman that needed more work than either of us fully admitted when we made the offer. We spent our first summer together tearing up carpet and painting over someone else's choices and arguing cheerfully about cabinet hardware. I have a photo from that summer, both of us covered in paint, exhausted, laughing at something I can't remember. I kept that photo for a long time. I'm not sure where it is now. Then there was Kara, my sister. 2 years younger. Brown eyes where I have green ones, my mother's laugh, my father's stubbornness. We had the kind of closeness that people remark on, the finishing each other's sentences kind, the 2-hour phone calls kind. She was my maid of honor. She gave a speech at our wedding that made Daniel's grandmother cry. She had a key to our house because of course she did. She came for dinner most Sunday evenings. And if she and Daniel got into a spirited debate about a movie or a sports team or whatever had been in the news that week, I sat back and watched and felt something I can only describe as fullness. My 2 favorite people. In my home. At my table. I never questioned it. I want to sit with that for a moment, because it's the part of the story I've had to make peace with. I never questioned it. Not because I was naive, I like to think I'm not, but because I had no framework for what was actually happening. The idea that Kara could want what I had badly enough to systematically dismantle it was simply not a shape my mind could form. That's the thing about betrayal that nobody warns you about. It doesn't announce itself. It uses your trust as camouflage. It looks, for a very long time, exactly like love. I was sitting on my couch on a perfectly ordinary Tuesday evening when I got the first sign that something had shifted. Daniel was beside me. Kara had texted asking if she could crash at ours for the night. I said yes without thinking twice. I always did. There is a specific kind of dread that has no name. It isn't fear exactly, because fear needs an object, something you can point at and say, that is what I'm afraid of. This was different. This was the feeling of walking through your own home and sensing, without evidence, that the air had changed. That something was subtly, unverifiably wrong. I lived in that feeling for 3 weeks before I understood it wasn't anxiety. It was instinct. And it was right. It started with Daniel's phone. Not in the way you might think. I wasn't snooping. I didn't have reason to. But I noticed the way he began placing it face down on the counter when he walked in. A habit he'd never had before. I noticed the slight lag before he answered simple questions. How was your day? Do you want Thai or pasta? Did you call the electrician? As though he were somewhere else and had to travel back to answer me. I noticed that when I reached for his hand during a movie one evening, he let me hold it, but didn't hold back. I told myself it was work. He was in the middle of a difficult quarter and his manager had been making his life miserable for months. I told myself I was projecting. I told myself that this was what long-term relationships looked like sometimes. Seasons of distance that passed on their own if you didn't press too hard on them. I am not naturally someone who ignores things. But I am someone who wants very badly to believe the best, and at 29, I was better at talking myself out of my instincts than I am now. Then, Ruth called. Daniel's mother was not an easy woman to read under normal circumstances. She was warm in the way of someone who had decided warmth was a virtue worth practicing. Deliberate, consistent, occasionally effortful. She had accepted me into their family carefully, the way someone loves their son enough to love what he loves, and over 3 years of Sunday dinners and Christmas mornings and a week-long family vacation in Maine, that careful affection had grown into something that felt real. She remembered how I took my coffee. She sent me articles she thought I'd find interesting. She called on my birthday before Daniel did. The call that Tuesday was 3 minutes long. She asked how I was in a tone that didn't want an honest answer. She mentioned that she and Daniel's father were thinking of visiting soon, then immediately said actually, they'd see. Things were busy. She said to take care of myself. She hung up before I could ask if everything was okay. I stood in the kitchen holding my phone and felt the floor tilt slightly. That evening I called Kara. She answered on the first ring, which she always did for me. I told her about Daniel's distance, about Ruth's strange call, about the formless dread I'd been carrying around for weeks. I heard her settle into her couch, the way she always did when she was preparing to be fully present for a conversation. She asked careful questions. She wanted specifics. What exactly did Ruth say? In what tone? How had Daniel been behaving at dinner versus alone at home? I gave her everything. I always gave her everything. She told me I was probably overthinking it. She said Daniel was clearly stressed about work, and that I had a tendency, she said it gently, the way only someone who's known you your whole life can say anything, to catastrophize when I felt insecure. She said Ruth had probably just had a long day. She said, "You two are solid. Don't create a problem that isn't there." I felt better after I hung up. That was the thing about Kara, she had always been able to talk me down from the ledge. I trusted her read on situations more than my own sometimes, because she was steadier than me, less reactive, more analytical. I thought of it as one of the great gifts of having her in my life. I didn't yet understand that she had spent that entire conversation collecting information. 2 nights later, Daniel came home, set his keys on the counter, and stood in the kitchen doorway for a long moment before he spoke. I was at the table with my laptop. I looked up. Something in his face made me close it. He said he needed some space. Not a separation, just space. He needed to process some things. I asked what things. He said he couldn't get into it yet. I asked if there was someone else. He looked at me in a way I didn't understand then, but do now. Guilty, I assumed. But it wasn't guilt about what I thought. It was something he was carrying that he hadn't fully sorted through yet. A story he'd been given. A version of me he was trying to reconcile with the person standing in front of him. He moved into the guest room that night. I called Kara. She came over within 20 minutes, let herself in with her key, and sat with me on the kitchen floor for 2 hours. She held my hand. She said all the right things. I thought, somewhere in the wreckage of that evening, at least I have her. That thought would come back to me later like a splinter, working its way to the surface. There are conversations that restructure time. Before and after. That Saturday morning became one of them. I have replayed it so many times that it no longer feels like a memory. It feels like a film I've watched too often, familiar in every detail, drained of the power to surprise me, but still, somehow not drained of the power to hurt. Daniel sat me down on a Saturday morning. The kind of ordinary Saturday that has no business holding the worst conversation of your life, sun coming through the kitchen windows, coffee still warm on the counter, the neighbor's dog barking at something in the yard next door. He was already dressed, which I noticed and filed away. He'd wanted to be armored for this. He told me that someone had come to him with information. Someone close to both of us. Someone with no motive to lie. And what that someone had told him was this, that for the better part of 7 months, I had been seeing a man named James. A coworker. Daniel described him, his car, the building where he worked, the restaurant near our office where we supposedly met for lunch. The level of detail was extraordinary. It was the kind of detail that could only come from someone who had constructed it carefully, who understood that vagueness is easy to dismiss, but specificity lodges in the mind like a hook. I knew James. He was a colleague I ate lunch with occasionally in a group setting, who had sent me a congratulations email when I got promoted, who existed in my life in the most peripheral, unremarkable way possible. The idea was so absurd that my first response wasn't even anger. It was a disoriented, almost laughing confusion. The feeling you get when someone says something so untethered from reality that your brain refuses to process it as a serious claim. That confusion lasted about 4 seconds. Then I looked at Daniel's face and understood that he was not confused at all. I told him it wasn't true. I told him clearly, directly, without hedging or qualifying, the way you speak when you have nothing to hide and the truth feels so obvious you can't imagine anyone doubting it. I told him I had never been unfaithful to him. Not with James. Not with anyone. Not once across 6 years of being together. I told him I didn't know where this had come from, but that whoever had said it was lying. He listened. And then he said something I have never forgotten. He said, she didn't want to tell me. She agonized over it for months. The word landed before the implication did. A half-second delay while my mind caught up with what my body already knew, because I felt the blood leave my face before I fully understood why. I asked him who. He hesitated. And in that hesitation, I already knew. I think some part of me had known since the night he moved into the guest room, since Ruth's 3-minute phone call, since all those evenings Kara had sat with me on the kitchen floor asking careful questions and absorbing every detail I gave her. I had known the shape of it without being able to name it. The way you sometimes know a dream is a nightmare before anything frightening has actually happened. He said her name. I went completely still. There is a silence that is the absence of sound, and there is a silence that is the presence of something too large for words. This was the second kind. I sat with it for what felt like a long time. The neighbor's dog had stopped barking. The coffee on the counter had gone cold. I said, Daniel. That is my sister. He said he knew. He said that was why he'd believed her. I asked him what proof she had given him. He described it, the dates, the hotel, the story she'd constructed with the patience and specificity of someone who had been building it brick by brick for months. He said she had cried when she told him. He said she had told him she loved both of us and that it had destroyed her to come forward. He said Ruth had been the one to encourage him to take it seriously, that Ruth had told him a woman doesn't say something like that about her own sister without cause. I sat across from my husband and watched him recite my sister's fiction as though it were history, and I understood something terrible. The story was too detailed and too emotionally credible to be easily dismantled. Kara had built something that would outlast my denial. She had understood that my word alone would not be enough. That in the absence of proof of innocence, the specificity of her accusation would fill the space. That evening, Ruth called me. The conversation was brief and final in the way of a door being closed. She said she was sorry. She said she hoped I would get the help I needed. She said she thought it was best if I gave Daniel the space to process. Then she said goodbye in a tone that meant something more than goodbye, and hung up. I sat in the dark of my living room for a long time. Then I called Kara. She answered on the second ring, and she was ready. She had the voice of someone who had rehearsed grief until it fit perfectly, the tremor in exactly the right places, the long pauses that performed reluctance. She said she was sorry. She said she had tried not to say anything. She said she had held it for so long, and it had eaten her alive. She said she did it because she loved Daniel like a brother, and she couldn't watch him be deceived. I want to tell you I screamed. I did, eventually. But first there was a long moment where I simply listened to her perform her suffering and felt something I can only describe as awe. Horrible, nauseating awe at how complete it was. There was no seam in it, no crack where the truth might get in. I found my voice, and I used it. I told her she was lying. I told her I knew exactly what she was doing, even if I didn't yet fully understand why. I told her that I was her sister, and she had just destroyed my marriage, and she needed to tell the truth right now, tonight, to Daniel and to his mother, and to anyone else she'd whispered this to. She cried harder. She said she understood I was hurting. She said she'd known I would react this way. My parents called the next morning. My mother's voice was careful and exhausted in the way of someone who had been up most of the night. She told me that Kara had called them, upset and frightened, and that attacking her was not going to help anyone. She told me that if what Kara was saying was true, the most loving thing the family could do was support me in getting help. She told me to calm down. I held the phone and listened to my mother tell me to calm down, and I understood something that settled into my chest like a stone and has never fully left. I was alone in this. Completely. The people who should have asked me first had already decided, and the person who had decided for them was the one they were calling to comfort. There is a difference between losing something and watching it be taken. When you lose something, there is accident involved. Misfortune. The randomness of a universe that doesn't organize itself around your well-being. You can grieve a loss without anger, because loss implies no one intended it. What happened to me that month was not loss. It was removal. Systematic, deliberate, and carried out by someone who knew exactly where to apply pressure, and in what order. I want to walk you through it, because I think it matters, not for the sake of pain, but because I've learned that when people hear, "I lost my marriage and my family in the same month," they imagine a single catastrophic event. A blow-up. A door slamming. What it actually looked like was quieter and more methodical than that, and somehow that made it worse. Daniel filed for separation 12 days after our kitchen conversation. 12 days. I have thought about that number often, about what it means that a 6-year relationship, 2 years of marriage, a house we had stripped to the studs and rebuilt together, could be reduced to a legal filing in under 2 weeks. He wasn't cruel about it. That almost made it harder. He was sad and resolute in the way of someone who had already done their grieving privately, who had been handed a conclusion and had spent those 12 days simply arriving at it. I asked him once more for the chance to prove it wasn't true. I asked if we could sit down together, the 3 of us, me, him, Kara, and let her say it to my face while I responded. He said he didn't think that would be productive. He said he didn't want to put Kara through that. He said those words. He didn't want to put Kara through that. And I had to leave the room because what I felt in that moment was too large and too dangerous to express to someone who was already gone. Ruth stopped returning my calls after the 3rd attempt. I don't blame her for this now in the way I did then. She was protecting her son, operating on the information she had been given, doing what mothers do. But at the time, Ruth's silence was its own specific devastation. She had been the closest thing I had to a second mother, and watching that door close was like losing a version of family I hadn't known I was capable of having until I had it. Daniel's family followed his lead, the way families do. His brother, who had been at our wedding, who had called me his sister-in-law with genuine warmth for 2 years, sent a single text saying he was sorry things had worked out this way. His aunt, who I had spent an entire Thanksgiving helping in the kitchen, simply ceased to exist in my life. No call, no message, nothing. That particular silence, the silence of people who were never required to choose but chose anyway, by default, by inertia, was one I carried for a long time. My own parents moved through those weeks in a way I found almost harder to bear than open hostility. They were not cruel. They were conflicted and uncomfortable, which meant they defaulted to the path of least resistance, and the path of least resistance was believing Kara. Because Kara was present and persuasive and I was on the other end of a phone screaming that none of it was true. Hysteria is easy to dismiss. Tears and composure are harder to argue with. Kara had understood that. She had shown up in person. She had been calm. I drove to my parents' house on a Wednesday evening. I sat at the kitchen table where I had done homework and eaten birthday dinners and had 1,000 ordinary conversations across my entire life, and I looked at my parents and told them the truth as plainly as I could manage. I told them there was no affair. I told them James was barely an acquaintance. I told them that their younger daughter had fabricated this, and that I needed them to believe me, and that I needed them to ask her to tell the truth. My father said he didn't want to take sides. My mother said she knew this was hard. Neither of them said they believed me. I drove home and sat in the driveway of the house that would no longer be mine within 30 days, and understood that there was nothing left to save. Not the marriage, which was already legally in motion toward its end. Not my in-laws, who had made their peace with their version of me. Not my parents, who had chosen a careful neutrality that functioned, in practice, exactly like choosing Kara. The 30 days it took to vacate the house were the longest of my life. Daniel and I moved around each other like strangers who had been assigned to the same space. Polite, careful, speaking only about logistics. Who would take the couch? Who had paid for the kitchen table? Whether I wanted the wedding photos or if he should just deal with them. I said I'd take them. I don't know why. I packed them in a box and taped it shut, and I have never opened it since. The last morning, I stood in the empty bedroom and looked at the walls we had painted together the first summer, a color we had argued about for 2 weeks before compromising on something neither of us loved, but both of us could live with. I had a strange impulse to say something out loud to the room, to the house, to the version of my life that had existed inside those walls. I didn't. I picked up the last box, walked out the front door, and didn't look back. Kara texted me that evening. She said, "I hope you're okay. I'm here if you ever need to talk." I stared at that message for a long time. Then, I put my phone in the box with the wedding photos, closed the trunk of my car, and drove toward a city where I could start over without anyone's version of me preceding my arrival. I didn't respond to her text. I never responded to her again. Nobody tells you what rebuilding actually looks like. I think we have a collective imagination about it, shaped by movies and motivational posts and stories that skip from the worst moment to the triumphant one with a tasteful montage in between. The protagonist hits rock bottom, and then there is a training sequence, a meaningful song, a passage of time indicated by falling leaves and rising sun, and then they emerge, polished, purposeful, ready. What it actually looked like for me was a blow-up mattress in Priya's spare room that deflated slightly every night, so that by morning I was sleeping 6 inches lower than when I'd started. It looked like a suitcase I lived out of for 3 weeks, because unpacking felt too permanent and too pitiful at the same time. It looked like lying awake at 2 a.m, running the same mental loop. How did I not see it? How did I not see it? How did I not see it? Until the loop wore a groove so deep it became a kind of white noise. Priya had been my closest friend from college, the kind of friend forged in the particular crucible of shared apartments and difficult professors, and the specific poverty of being 22, and figuring out what your life was supposed to look like. When I called her from a gas station parking lot 2 hours outside the city I had shared with Daniel, she said 2 things. She said, "Come here." And she said, "I'm not going to make you talk about it until you want to." Those 2 sentences were the most useful things anyone said to me in the first month. She kept both promises. I found an apartment 6 weeks after arriving. 4th floor of a building that smelled faintly of someone else's cooking, with a window in the bedroom that looked directly into the window of the building next door. It was the least charming apartment I had ever seen, and I signed the lease with something close to relief, because it was mine in a way that nothing had been mine in a very long time. No history. No version of myself that anyone here had already decided on. Just walls and a window, and the particular freedom of starting from nothing. The job I found was beneath what I'd been doing before the move. I had been a project manager at a mid-size firm, a role I had grown into over 4 years and was genuinely good at. What I found in the new city was a coordinator position, entry-level in most regards, 40 minutes by bus, a boss who was pleasant but incurious. I took it because I needed income, and because I wasn't ready yet to walk into an interview and perform ambition I didn't currently feel. I needed somewhere to put my days while I figured out how to be a person again. The first 3 months are not something I look back on clearly. They exist in my memory as a kind of weather system, gray and uniform, with occasional moments of sharp, specific pain breaking through, and then gray again. I went to work. I came home. I ate whatever required the least effort. I called my parents on Sundays out of obligation and had conversations so carefully surface level they might as well have been exchanges with a customer service representative. Kara's name was never mentioned. The separation was never mentioned. We talked about the weather and a television show my mother was watching and whether my father's knee was improving. I understand now that they were hoping the silence would eventually become normal, that if everyone avoided the open wound long enough, it would close on its own. I did not call Kara. She called me once, 4 weeks after I moved. I watched her name on the screen until it stopped. Then I blocked the number. It was the easiest decision I made that entire year. Somewhere around month 4, something shifted. I want to be precise about this because I've thought about it often. It wasn't a revelation. It wasn't a morning where I woke up and felt the sun differently. It was smaller than that. A Tuesday evening when I was sitting on my second-hand couch eating pasta I had actually cooked instead of ordered. Watching a documentary about architecture that I had chosen without considering whether Daniel would have wanted to watch it too, and I noticed something. I was not unhappy in that moment. Quiet, yes. Lonely sometimes, still carrying everything, certainly. But there was something underneath all of that. Something small and stubborn and entirely my own that was still intact. I have never been able to fully explain what that felt like except to say that it was the first proof I had that Kara had been wrong. She had written, in a message I wouldn't read for 4 more years, "She'll fall apart. She always does." And I had almost proved her right. I had come close enough to the edge that I could feel it, but I had not gone over. The next morning, I looked up a professional certification course I had been deferring for 2 years because there had always been something more immediately demanding. The house, Daniel's work schedule, the logistics of a shared life that consume more time than you realize until they're gone. I enrolled before I could talk myself out of it. It cost more than I was comfortable spending. I paid it anyway. I also started running. Not because I had any particular feeling about running. I had never been someone who ran, but because I needed somewhere to put the energy that had previously gone into surviving the end of my marriage, and I had to start channeling it somewhere constructive before it turned inward. The first run was 12 minutes before I had to stop. The second was 15. By month 6, I was running 40 minutes 3 times a week without thinking much about it, and I had started to understand why people do it. Not for the fitness, but for the hour every other day where the only thing required of you is to keep moving forward. Priya took me out for my 30th birthday. Just the 2 of us, a restaurant neither of us could fully afford. A bottle of wine we split down the middle. She gave a small toast, the kind that holds a lot without saying too much. And I sat across from her in a restaurant in a city I had chosen by necessity and thought, I am going to be all right. Not today. Not fully. But eventually. I am going to be genuinely, solidly all right. I didn't know yet how I knew that. I just knew, and I held it quietly. The way you hold something fragile that you're not ready to examine too closely yet, carefully, with both hands, trying not to look directly at it in case it turned out to be less real than it felt. It turned out to be more real than I thought anything could be again. Let me tell you who I became while no one was watching. Not in the way people mean when they say that, the implication being that the becoming was spite-fueled, that every achievement was a middle finger pointed back at someone who doubted you. That's a satisfying story. It's just not an entirely honest one. The truth is more complicated, and I think more interesting. Because the person I became over those 4 years wasn't built in opposition to anything. She was built quietly, without an audience, without a destination in mind, simply because building was the only thing that made sense to keep doing. I was 33 the autumn Daniel called. By then, I had been in the new city long enough that it no longer felt like the city I had retreated to. It felt like mine. I knew which coffee shop had the best corner table for working on a Saturday morning. I knew which running route turned unbearable in August humidity, and which one stayed shaded enough to manage. I had a regular order at the Thai place 2 blocks from my apartment, and they started making it when they saw me come through the door. These are small things. I am listing them deliberately, because the accumulation of small things that belong entirely to you is not a small thing at all. The certification course I had enrolled in during my 4th month of rebuilding had led, through a sequence of steps that felt accidental at the time but looked deliberate in retrospect, to a senior project management role at a firm I genuinely respected. I had been promoted twice in 3 years. I managed a team of 7. I was not wealthy in any dramatic sense, but I was stable in a way that felt earned in every cell. The kind of financial security that means something different when you built it from a blow-up mattress and an entry-level job than when it was simply always there. I had done therapy. 2 years of it with a woman named Dr. Osei, who had the rare and valuable quality of refusing to let me perform insight instead of actually having it. She had a habit of sitting quietly after I said something, long enough that I'd feel compelled to fill the silence, and the thing I said to fill the silence was almost always truer than what I'd said before it. I had, in that room, over the course of 2 years, worked through the marriage and the loss of it, and the specific grief of being disbelieved by the people who should have been first in line to believe you. I had worked through the part that I was most reluctant to examine, the way I had made it easy for Kara, how completely I had trusted her, how little I had protected myself, because it had never occurred to me that I needed protecting from her. That last part took the longest. I want to be honest about that. My relationship with my parents existed in an uneasy middle space. We spoke. We saw each other at 2 family events over those 4 years, a cousin's wedding and my father's retirement dinner, where everyone performed normality with the commitment of people who had collectively decided that if they held the performance together long enough, it might become real. Kara had been at both events. We did not speak at either. We existed in the same rooms with a careful mutual avoidance that everyone around us chose not to acknowledge. Because acknowledging it would mean acknowledging everything that had created it. My mother called more regularly than my father. She asked about work and about Priya, and once, tentatively, whether I was seeing anyone. I was not. I had dated a little, a few months with a man named Theo who was kind and uncomplicated and ultimately wanted something I wasn't ready to give, which was certainty. The ending had been mutual and undramatic, and I had felt, afterward, more relief than sadness, which told me something important about where I still was. My father expressed things in texts rather than calls. Short ones, with the compressed emotional syntax of a man who was raised to associate vulnerability with weakness and had spent his entire life trying to quietly unlearn that without having the vocabulary to do it openly. He sent me an article about a project management methodology he thought I'd find interesting. He texted happy birthday with a cake emoji that I was almost certain my mother had shown him how to use. He texted, the day I told them about the promotion, "That's my girl." 3 words. I read it 4 times. He had never, directly, said he was sorry for not believing me. Neither had my mother. This was the piece I was still carrying, still in the process of deciding what to do with. Dr. Ose had helped me understand that an apology is not the only form a reckoning can take, that people sometimes express remorse through behavior rather than words, through showing up differently rather than naming what they'd done wrong. I understood this intellectually. Emotionally, it was more complicated. The wound was there. It had closed over, mostly. But it was there. Kara and I had not spoken in 4 years. I had no reliable information about her life. I had unfollowed her on everything within the first year, quietly, without announcement. Because I didn't want the drama of a block, but I also couldn't absorb the mundane evidence of her daily life continuing as though nothing had happened. Priya, who still had mutual connections, mentioned once that Kara and Daniel had been spending time together. She watched my face carefully when she said it, the way a good friend watches for the thing you might not say out loud. I nodded. I said, I figured, and I had. Not from the beginning, but from the moment Daniel had said the words she didn't want to tell me with that particular tenderness. The tenderness of someone who has been handled carefully by someone who wanted to be close to them. I had turned that moment over many times in 4 years, and each time it looked more like what it was. Not a friend of the marriage trying to protect it, but someone who wanted to be inside it. Someone who had looked at my life and decided she wanted the most important thing in it for herself. I had stopped being angry about it somewhere around year 3. Not because I had forgiven it. I hadn't, or at least not in any way that felt complete, but because the anger had simply run out of fuel. You can only run on rage for so long before your body starts billing you for it. What replaced the anger was something quieter and harder to name, a kind of settled knowledge. A certainty that I knew the truth of my own life even when no one around me did. That turned out to be enough to live on. It was a Tuesday evening in October, ordinary in every respect. I had been for a run. I was making dinner. My phone was on the counter and I was not thinking about Daniel or Kara or any of it. I was thinking about whether I needed to go to the grocery store or could make do with what I had, when the screen lit up with a number I hadn't seen in 4 years. I stood there with a wooden spoon in my hand and looked at it. He called twice. The second time, I picked up. His voice was the first thing that told me how serious it was. I had braced myself in the 3 seconds between answering and speaking for a range of possibilities. A practical matter, some leftover administrative thread from the divorce that had surfaced after years. An awkward reach-out driven by guilt or nostalgia or one too many drinks on a Tuesday night. I had even, in some distant corner of my mind, prepared for the possibility that he was calling to tell me he and Kara were engaged, that he wanted me to hear it from him before someone else said it. The kind of courtesy that arrives too late to be truly kind. I had not prepared for the voice I actually heard. It was hollowed out. That is the only way I can describe it. Daniel had always had a certain quality of steadiness in his voice, even at the end of our marriage. Even in the worst conversations, there had been a foundation under it. Something load-bearing. What I heard on that Tuesday evening was the voice of someone whose foundation had been knocked out from under them recently and without warning. He sounded like a person standing in the middle of a room where all the furniture had just been removed, trying to figure out where to stand. He said my name. Then he said, "I need to tell you something. I'm not calling to. This isn't about getting back anything. I just need you to know something before I do anything with it. You deserve to know first." I turned off the stove. I moved to the couch and sat down. I said, "Okay, tell me." He had been cleaning out a storage unit, he explained. The kind of slow, deferred task that accumulates in the aftermath of a life restructured. Boxes that got moved without being opened. Items that didn't fit the new apartment, but felt too significant to discard. The physical residue of a shared life that nobody quite knows how to process. In one of those boxes, he had found an old tablet. A shared one we had bought early in our marriage for traveling, which had been replaced and forgotten about within a year. He had almost thrown it away without turning it on. He had not thrown it away without turning it on. The tablet had been connected to the apartment's Wi-Fi automatically when he brought the box home. It had, while sitting on his kitchen counter charging, quietly synced 4 years of backed-up data, including a messaging application, including a thread between Kara and a friend of hers named Becca that dated back, in its relevant portions, almost 6 years. He started to tell me what was in the messages, and I made him stop. I asked him to take a breath. He did. I could hear it, unsteady, effortful. The breath of someone trying to hold themselves together through an act of will. I asked him to start from the beginning. He did. The messages began, in their earliest relevant form, as what anyone might have read as ordinary. Kara venting about her life, her dating history, her dissatisfaction with where she'd ended up relative to where she'd imagined. Becca responding with the comfortable shorthand of a long friendship. Normal. Unremarkable. And then, gradually, over the course of months, a subject began emerging with increasing frequency. Danielle. At first it was framed as concern, a sister-in-law's worry, affection that positioned itself as familial. She wrote about his qualities with the careful language of someone who knows they are writing something they shouldn't and is trying to give it a more acceptable shape. She wrote about how much she enjoyed their conversations. She wrote about how she and Daniel had a particular understanding that felt different from what she observed between him and me. She wrote, in one message that Daniel read to me in a voice completely stripped of expression. Sometimes I think he ended up with the wrong sister. I said nothing. I let him keep going. The shift happened, according to the thread, about 8 months before everything fell apart. Something had changed in Kara, some threshold crossed, some decision made. The messages became less wistful and more purposeful. She wrote to Becca that she had been thinking about it for a long time, and she didn't see why she should spend her life watching someone else have what should have been hers. Becca, to her credit, pushed back. Daniel was married. He was happy. Kara needed to let it go. Kara's response was a message Daniel read to me slowly, carefully. The way you read something you want the other person to hear in full. He's only happy because he doesn't know what he's missing. I just need to remove the obstacle. She's not as solid as she looks. I know exactly where the cracks are. I had my hand pressed flat against my sternum without realizing it. Feeling my own heartbeat, making sure it was still there. Daniel kept reading. The fabrication had been constructed over 3 months. Kara had chosen James specifically. She wrote about her reasoning to Becca with the methodical clarity of someone working through a project, because he was real enough to be verifiable, but peripheral enough that I would have no deep alibi. She had chosen a hotel she had heard me mention once, offhandedly, as somewhere my company had put up a visiting client. She had constructed a timeline that ran parallel to a period when Daniel and I had been going through a difficult stretch, the bad season I mentioned earlier, the one we had survived and come out of closer for it. She had watched that stretch from the inside, from our dinner table and our kitchen floor, and she had cataloged it and used it. She had told Becca, before she went to Daniel, "The trick is the detail. Anyone can make an accusation. What they can't argue with is specificity." There was a message from after she had spoken to Daniel. A single line to Becca, sent the night our marriage began its formal collapse. "It's done. He believes me. She'll fall apart, she always does. And I'll be there." Daniel stopped reading. The line landed the same way it would land again 4 years later when I finally saw it myself in the screenshots he sent after we hung up. Not as a surprise, because by then nothing could surprise me, but as a kind of confirmation that settled something in my chest that had been unsettled for 4 years. The knowledge that it had been this deliberate, this complete, that she had not acted in a moment of weakness or jealousy that overtook her better judgment. She had planned it. She had executed it. And she had done it with the confidence of someone who knew me well enough to predict exactly how I would respond to being destroyed. Daniel was crying by the end. Not loudly, quietly, the way men who were raised not to cry in front of people cry when they can no longer help it. He said he was sorry. He said it multiple times in different configurations, as though he were trying to find the arrangement of words that would be adequate, and kept discovering there wasn't one. He said he should have fought harder to hear my side. He said he should have questioned it. He said Ruth had believed it so completely, and he had needed someone to tell him what to do with the information, and Ruth had told him, and he had let that be enough. I listened to all of it. I let him say it. Then I said, "I know." Not as absolution. Not as an invitation to feel better. Just as the truth. I knew why he had believed it. I had understood, even in the worst of it, why a story that specific, delivered by a person that close, with the emotional credibility Kara had performed, had been believed. Understanding it had not made it hurt less, but it had made it something I could eventually carry without it defining my posture. He asked if I wanted him to send me the screenshots. I said yes. He asked what I was going to do. I looked around my apartment, the one I had chosen alone, filled alone, built into a life alone, and I told him the truth. I said, "I'm going to think about it." We stayed on the phone for another few minutes, saying very little, in the way of two people who have just passed something heavy between them and need a moment before either of them moves. Then he said goodnight, I said goodnight. And I sat in the quiet of my apartment with my phone in my lap, and the screenshots arriving one by one in a thread that I opened but did not read that night. I made dinner instead. I ate it at my table. I went to bed at a reasonable hour. The truth had waited 4 years. It could wait one more night while I decided what I was going to do with it. I read the screenshots the next morning. I made coffee first. I showered. I ate breakfast at my table by the window the way I did every morning, watching the building across the street wake up, lights coming on in sequence. A man on the 3rd floor who always stood at his window with his coffee at the same time I stood at mine. A ritual we had never acknowledged but had been sharing for 2 years without either of us knowing the other noticed. I did all of these ordinary things first because I understood, without quite articulating it to myself, that I needed to be grounded before I opened them. That the version of me who read those messages needed to be steady, not raw. Then I sat on my couch, put both feet flat on the floor, and read. It took 40 minutes. Daniel had sent everything, not just the excerpts he'd read to me the night before, but the entire thread, stretching back years, every message that was relevant and many that weren't. I read it all. I read the early ones, where Kara's feelings were still half buried in plausible language. I read the middle ones, where the planning began, methodical, specific, surprisingly businesslike in tone for something so personal. I read the ones from after. The ones where she reported back to Becca on my unraveling with the detached interest of someone monitoring an experiment. I put my phone down when I finished and sat quietly for a long time. I want to tell you what I felt, because I think it matters, and because I think people expect a certain answer. They expect rage. They expect the clean, energizing rush of vindication, the moment where the wronged person finally has proof in hand and the world snaps back into the correct shape. I had some of that. I won't pretend I didn't. There was a moment, somewhere in the middle of reading, where something hot and electric moved through me and I thought, there it is. There is the truth. There it is in her own words. But that moment passed, and what remained after it was quieter and more complicated than I had expected. What I felt, mostly, was tired. Not the exhaustion of defeat, I want to be precise about this. Not the tiredness of someone who has been worn down and has nothing left. It was the tiredness of someone who has been carrying a weight for 4 years and has just been told, definitively, that they were right to carry it. That the weight was real. That they hadn't imagined it. That it was exactly as heavy as it felt. There is a particular exhaustion in being vindicated, in having every instinct confirmed at once. It doesn't feel the way you think it will. I called Priya. She came over within the hour, sat across from me at my kitchen table, and read the screenshots in complete silence. I watched her face move through several distinct emotional phases, confusion giving way to comprehension. Comprehension giving way to a cold, focused fury that I recognized as the specific anger of someone watching their person be hurt. When she finished, she looked up at me and said, "What do you want to do?" Not, "What are you going to do to her?" Not, "She needs to pay for this." Just, "What do you want?" It was the right question. It was the only question. And I appreciated her for knowing that. I told her I didn't know yet. She nodded and put the kettle on, and we sat together for the better part of an afternoon turning it over. She laid out the options the way Priya has always approached problems, methodically, without emotional inflation. I could go to my parents first. I could confront Kara directly. I could send Kara the screenshots with no message and let her sit with the knowledge that I knew. I could send them to everyone simultaneously, parents, Kara, anyone who had been given her version of me, and let the truth land all at once like a controlled demolition. Each option had a version of satisfaction attached to it, and a version of cost. Going to my parents first meant entering a conversation I had no guarantee of controlling. They had not believed me once. What made me certain that screenshots, even screenshots as clear and damning as these, would land differently when filtered through 4 years of having built their understanding of events around Kara's version. There was a real possibility they would find a way to complicate it, to minimize. My mother's first instinct when presented with an uncomfortable truth about someone she loved had always been to find the angle that softened it. I had watched her do it my entire life. I had even, when it was directed at me and not against me, found it comforting. A direct confrontation with Kara held its own complications. I had spent 4 years building a life that was not organized around her. Walking back into her orbit, even in opposition, felt like a concession I wasn't sure I wanted to make. There was also the question of what I wanted from a confrontation. An apology? She was not going to give me a real one. I had known Kara long enough to understand that she was constitutionally incapable of accountability that cost her something. Whatever remorse she was capable of would be the performative kind, carefully calibrated to make herself sympathetic, rather than to genuinely reckon with what she had done. The option of sending the screenshots with no message had a certain appeal, I'll admit. The image of Kara opening her phone to find 4 years of her private planning laid out in front of her. The knowledge that I knew, delivered without a word. Clean. Final. But it also felt like the option most likely to give her the chance to get ahead of it. To call my parents before I did, to frame the screenshots somehow, to construct yet another story. What I kept coming back to, across all of it, was a question Dr. Osei had asked me once in a session, in a different context, that had lodged somewhere permanent. What does justice look like to you? Separate from what it looks like to everyone else. I had sat with that question for a week after she asked it, and I still hadn't fully answered it. I sat with it again that afternoon. Here is what I arrived at. I did not want a dramatic confrontation. I did not want to engineer a scene where Kara was publicly exposed, and I stood at the center of it watching her unravel the way she had watched me. That version of events had a certain narrative logic. The symmetry of it was almost elegant. But it wasn't what I actually wanted. What I wanted was simpler and harder to perform. I wanted the people who had believed her version of me to be given, without pressure or spectacle, the truth. Not my truth, the truth, her own words. I wanted them to have to sit with those words and understand what they had participated in, even unknowingly, even passively. And then I wanted to step back and let them do whatever they were going to do with it. I was not going to beg for apologies. I was not going to perform my vindication. I was not going to arrive at anyone's door shaking with the urgency of being believed, the way I had arrived at my parents' kitchen table 4 years ago, desperate and disbelieved. I was going to be still. I was going to let the truth move through the people who needed to receive it. And I was going to trust that it was enough, that after 4 years of carrying the weight of her lie, the truth didn't need me to push it. It just needed to be released. I told Priya. She listened. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That's either the most evolved thing I've ever heard, or you're just tired." I laughed. It was the first full laugh I had managed since Daniel's call. I said, "Both. Definitely both." She stayed for dinner. We opened a bottle of wine and talked about other things. Her job, a trip she was planning, a terrible date she'd been on the week before, that she had been saving to tell me in person. We laughed more. The screenshots sat on my phone, unopened since morning. That night, before I went to sleep, I sent Daniel a message. I said, "I've thought about it. Can you go to Ruth first? She should hear it from you. I'll handle my parents." He responded within minutes. He said yes. He said he was ready whenever I was. I put my phone down and turned off the light. For the first time in 4 years, I fell asleep without running the loop. I have thought a lot about the word confrontation, and why it doesn't quite fit what happened next. A confrontation implies two forces meeting head-on. It implies drama and raised voices and the theatrical release of pressure that has been building toward a single moment. What actually happened over those 10 days was quieter than that, and, in its own way, more complete. It didn't feel like a confrontation. It felt like a tide going out. Slow, inevitable, indifferent to anyone's preference about the timing. Daniel called Ruth on a Thursday evening. He told me afterward that he had sat with the tablet in his lap for 20 minutes before dialing, running through what he was going to say, trying to find an order for it that would land cleanly. He said there was no clean order. He said he eventually just called and started talking and let it be as messy as it was. He told her he had found something she needed to see. He drove to her house that same evening and sat across from her at the kitchen table where I had eaten dozens of Sunday dinners, and he showed her everything. He described it to me later in careful, measured language, the language of someone reporting an event they were still processing themselves. He said Ruth read the screenshots twice. He said she did not speak for a long time after the second reading. He said when she finally looked up, her face had the particular quality of someone who has just understood something that restructures a significant portion of their recent past, and that it was not a comfortable thing to watch. She asked him one question. "Does Maya know you're showing me this?" He said yes. She nodded. Then she picked up her phone and called me. I had been waiting. Not anxiously. I had moved through that Thursday with deliberate normalcy, gone to work, made dinner, gone for a run in the early evening dark. But when my phone showed Ruth's name, I sat down before I answered, the way you sit down for something you've been standing braced against for a long time. She spoke first. She said, "I owe you an apology that I don't know how to make large enough." I had imagined this phone call many times over 4 years, in the way you involuntarily imagine things you've been denied. The writing of the record, the acknowledgement from the people who had turned away. In those imagined versions, I had always known exactly what to say. Something precise and quietly devastating that communicated the full weight of what their belief in Kara's story had cost me. Something that would land with the gravity it deserved. What I actually said was, "Thank you for calling," and I meant it. Not as a performance of graciousness. I wasn't feeling gracious, exactly. But I had spent 4 years learning the difference between what I needed to say and what I actually needed. And what I needed from Ruth in that moment was not a reckoning. It was simply to be seen clearly, to have her understand, without me having to convince her, that the woman she had known across those Sunday dinners had been exactly who she appeared to be. She gave me that. She said it plainly and without deflection. She said she had believed Kara because Kara had been present and persuasive, and because the story had confirmed a fear she'd already been carrying quietly, that Daniel's marriage had moved too fast, that I had always been slightly unknowable to her. She said she recognized, saying it out loud, how unfair that was. She said she was sorry for the cold phone call. She was sorry for the door she had closed. She was sorry for the 4 years of silence that followed. I listened to all of it. I said, "I know you loved him. I understand why you protected him." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I should have protected you too." We stayed on the phone for another few minutes. When we hung up, something in my chest that had been braced for 4 years released slightly, not fully, not all at once, but the way a knot loosens when the right amount of pressure is applied in exactly the right direction. My parents were harder. I had expected this. Daniel had offered to be the one to go to them the way he'd gone to Ruth, to sit across from them with the tablet and let the evidence speak without requiring me to be in the room for it. I had thought about this for several days and decided that I wanted him to go. Not because I was afraid to face them myself, but because I understood that my presence would change the dynamic in ways that would ultimately make it easier for everyone to avoid the central truth. My parents loved me. They also, and the particular way of people who love their children imperfectly had a long-established habit of managing my emotions rather than sitting with the harder work of examining their own. If I was in the room, the conversation would become about reassuring me. I didn't want to be reassured. I wanted them to look at the evidence without the distraction of my reaction to their reaction. So Daniel drove to their house on a Saturday morning. He called me afterward from the parking lot, still sitting in his car. He said my mother had cried through most of it. He said my father had not cried, but had sat very still in the way of a man absorbing something that required the full capacity of his stillness to contain. He said he had shown them the screenshots on the tablet itself, the original, not copies, because he had understood instinctively that the physical object would make it harder to distance themselves from. He said my mother had asked, at one point, whether it was possible the messages were fabricated or taken out of context, and that my father had put his hand on her arm before Daniel could respond and said, "Enough. Read it again." She had read it again. Daniel said that by the end my father had not spoken for a long time, that he had sat at the kitchen table staring at the tablet with an expression that was not grief exactly, and not anger exactly, but something older and more difficult. The expression of a man understanding precisely where he had failed and being unable to do anything about the years the failure had already consumed. My mother called me that afternoon. The call was long, almost 2 hours, and I want to be honest with you about what it was and wasn't, because I think the honest version matters more than the clean version. She apologized. Genuinely, at length, with the specific texture of remorse that comes from someone who has understood not just that they were wrong, but the full shape of the wrongness. Not only the conclusion they'd reached, but every smaller choice along the way that led them to it. She said she should have called me first. She said she should have asked me before she decided. She said she had taken the path of least resistance and dressed it up as neutrality, and that she had known, somewhere beneath all of it, that neutrality in a situation like that was not actually neutral at all. I believed her. I want to be clear about that. I believe my mother's remorse was real. And then, 20 minutes before the end of the call, she said something that I have since made peace with, but that landed hard in the moment. She said, "She's still my daughter too." I don't know how to reconcile that. I was quiet for a moment. Then I said, "I know. I'm not asking you to stop loving her," and I meant that. I had spent enough time with Dr. Osei to understand that my parents loving Kara was not a finite resource drawn from the same pool as their love for me, that their capacity to love her did not diminish what they owed me. But I also understood, in that moment, that the reconciliation with my parents was going to be a process, a long one. Not a phone call, but a series of them. Not a single reckoning, but a slow and sometimes uncomfortable rebuilding of trust between people who had broken it and the person it had been broken with. I had known this going in. I had prepared myself for it. What I hadn't fully prepared myself for was my father's text, which arrived 40 minutes after I hung up with my mother. 5 words. "I should have asked you first." I sat with that text for a long time. It was not enough. I want to be honest about that. It was not enough for 4 years of being disbelieved. 4 years of absence and loss and rebuilding from nothing. But it was real. It was my father, who expressed almost nothing directly, expressing something directly. It was a man sitting at a kitchen table with the weight of a significant failure and choosing, at least in that small way, to name it. I saved the text. I still have it. Kara was confronted by my parents 2 days later. I was not there, and did not want to be. My mother told me about it afterward in pieces, across several conversations, with the careful tone of someone delivering information they know will be painful regardless of how it's packaged. Kara had not confessed immediately. This did not surprise me. She had denied it first, not with the hysterical energy of someone caught, but with a calm that my mother described as initially convincing. The calm of someone who had been rehearsing for the possibility of discovery for a long time. She said the messages were old and misrepresented. She said she had been going through something difficult at the time and had vented to Becca in ways that didn't reflect her actual actions. She said Daniel had always had a complicated dynamic with her, and this was his way of rewriting history. My father had placed the tablet on the table and pointed to a specific message without speaking. My mother said he kept his finger on it until Kara read it. She went quiet after that. The composure cracked in a way that, my mother said, was different from her usual tears, not performed for once, but the actual silence of someone who was run out of road. She did not confess with words. She simply stopped denying, which in its own way was the same thing. She did not call me. I did not expect her to. The apology, if it ever came, was not going to come quickly or cleanly. It was going to take Kara a long time to find her way to accountability that cost her something real, and I had learned enough about my own needs by then to know that I could not wait for her timeline to feel whole. My wholeness was not contingent on her remorse. I had already built it without her. Daniel sent me a message the evening after my parents' confrontation with Kara. He had been checking in periodically throughout the 10 days, brief messages, practical in tone, asking if I'd heard from my parents, letting me know how Ruth was processing things. This one was different. It said, "I've been trying to figure out how to say this for days. For whatever it's worth, and I know it may not be worth much after everything, I know now that I should have fought harder to hear your side. You deserved that. I'm sorry I didn't give it to you." I read it twice. Then I put my phone down and looked out the window at the building across the street, at the 3rd floor where the man with the morning coffee stood. Though it was evening now, and the window was dark, I thought about what it would have meant to receive that message at 29, how desperately I had wanted exactly those words. How I had constructed entire imagined conversations in the early months where Daniel said precisely this, and I was able to feel, finally, that the record had been corrected. I thought about how differently those words landed now, at 33, in an apartment I had built into a life entirely my own, not less meaningful, but differently weighted. The ground under me was no longer dependent on what anyone said or didn't say. It had been built out of other materials. I wrote back, "It means something. Thank you." I sent it and closed the thread. Outside, the city was doing what it always did in the early evening. Lights coming on in sequence. The particular hum of a Tuesday winding toward its end. I had a run planned for the morning. A call with Priya on Wednesday. A presentation at work on Thursday I felt quietly good about. The truth had moved through every person who needed it. It had done what truth does when you stop trying to force it and simply release it. It had found its own level. Some of it had landed clean. Some of it had landed complicated. Some of it was still in the process of being absorbed by people who were taking longer than I would have liked. All of that was okay. I had stopped needing the landing to be perfect some time ago. I want to tell you something that took me a long time to understand. The truth coming out did not fix everything. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think the dishonest version of this story ends with the revelation and lets you assume the rest, that the apologies were sufficient, that the relationships snapped back into place, that the 4 years of absence were retroactively healed by 10 days of reckoning. That version is tidier. It is also a lie, and I have had enough of those to last several lifetimes. What the truth coming out actually did was create the conditions for things to begin. That is different from fixing them. It removed the false foundation that everything had been built on and left the real materials exposed. The love that was genuine, the failures that were real, the work that still needed doing. What happened next depended entirely on what each person decided to do with those materials. My parents and I have been rebuilding for 8 months now. It is slow and sometimes uncomfortable, and occasionally unexpectedly tender. My mother calls twice a week instead of once. She asks real questions now, not the careful surface-level ones from the years of managed distance, but questions that reach further, that seem to want honest answers rather than comfortable ones. She asked me once, about 3 months after everything came out, what the hardest part of those 4 years had been. I told her the truth. It wasn't losing Daniel, and it wasn't losing the house, and it wasn't even starting over in a new city with nothing. The hardest part had been being disbelieved by the people who were supposed to know me best. The people who should have asked me first. She was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, "I know. I'm going to spend a long time being sorry for that." I told her she didn't have to spend a long time being sorry. She just had to spend a long time being different. That was what I actually needed. My father has not become a man who expresses things easily. That was never going to happen, and I stopped needing it to somewhere around my mid-20s. But he drove 4 hours to have lunch with me on a random Wednesday in February, with no occasion attached to it. No birthday or holiday to justify the trip. He sat across from me at a restaurant near my apartment, and we talked for 3 hours about everything and nothing. His retirement, my work. A book we had both apparently been reading without knowing it. When he left, he held me for a moment longer than he usually did. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. That lunch meant more to me than any apology he could have constructed with words. Some people show you who they are through what they say. Others show you through what they drive 4 hours to do on a Wednesday. I come from the second kind, and I have made a certain peace with that. Ruth and I exchanged a few messages in the months after her call. They were careful and warm in equal measure. 2 people feeling out the terms of something that had been broken and might, in time, be rebuilt into a different shape. She sent me a long email once that I have read several times. She said she had thought about me often over the 4 years of silence in ways she hadn't known how to act on. That she had occasionally looked at a recipe she knew I liked, or read something she thought would interest me, and felt the complicated guilt of someone who knows they've closed a door they shouldn't have. She said she hoped I was well. She said she was proud of what she'd heard I'd built. I wrote back, "We are not what we were. I don't think we will be. And I'm not sure either of us needs us to be. But there is something there, something honest and unforced. That is enough." Kara and I have not spoken. I want to be careful about how I tell this part, because I think it is the part people most want a resolution to, and the part I am least able to provide one for. She has not reached out. My mother tells me, in the careful way she now navigates the space between her 2 daughters, that Kara is struggling. That the confrontation shook something loose in her that hasn't fully settled. That she has been in her own therapy. That she has expressed remorse to my parents in the fragmented way of someone who is only beginning to understand the full shape of what they've done. I don't know what to do with that yet. I hold it at a distance and examine it occasionally and put it back down. The question of whether Kara and I will ever speak again is one I am not ready to answer. Not because I am protecting myself from a decision I've already made, but because I genuinely don't know, and I have learned to be honest about the things I genuinely don't know, rather than constructing false certainties in either direction. What I know is this: I am not waiting for her. My life is not organized around the question of Kara. It hasn't been for a long time, and the revelation and its aftermath did not change that. If something eventually becomes possible between us, real, honest, built on a foundation that has no lies in it, I will decide then what I want to do. But that possibility is hers to create, not mine to wait for. I have already done enough waiting in this story. I still live in the apartment on the 4th floor. The man on the 3rd floor of the building across the street still stands at his window with his coffee at the same time I stand at mine. We still have not acknowledged each other, and I find I prefer it that way. Some small rituals of parallel living are better left unnamed. I still run 3 times a week. I went further than I ever have last spring. Signed up for a half marathon on a dare from Priya and finished it in a time I was genuinely proud of, legs burning, the particular joy of the body having done something it didn't know it could. Priya was at the finish line with a sign that was embarrassing enough that I have asked her never to display it in public again, and she has refused. My career is the thing I am most quietly proud of, not because of any particular achievement, but because of what it represents. The direct product of having had nothing. The certification I enrolled in during month 4 of rebuilding has led, in the way that one real decision tends to lead through a series of other real decisions, to work I find genuinely meaningful, and a team I am glad to spend my days with. I did not plan it. I just kept making the next right choice, and trusted that a path was being built underneath me, even when I couldn't see it. I think about 29-year-old Maya sometimes, the one sitting on the kitchen floor with her sister's arm around her, not yet knowing that the arm around her was the source of the wound. I think about what I would say to her if I could. I used to think I would tell her to pay closer attention, to question Kara earlier, to trust her instincts when they told her something had shifted. But I've moved away from that version. It asks her to be suspicious of love before love has given her reason to be, and I'm not willing to tell her that's how she should have lived. What I would actually tell her is simpler. I would tell her, the people who are supposed to ask you first will sometimes fail you. That failure will cost you things that cannot be replaced, and you will build something in the aftermath that is more entirely yours than anything you had before, because you will build it without anyone's permission and without anyone's help, and it will have your name on every single brick. I would tell her Kara was wrong about you. You did not fall apart. You came close enough that the distinction felt academic at the time, but you did not go over. I would tell her, 4 years from a Tuesday night when your phone rings with a number you haven't seen in 4 years, you are going to be sitting in an apartment you chose, in a city you chose, in a life that fits you in a way your old one never quite did. And when that call comes, you are going to answer it from a place so solid that nothing it tells you will knock you down. It will hurt. It will be complicated. It will require more from you than you expect. And you will handle it. I would tell her, you are going to be okay. Not in the provisional way you keep telling yourself right now, the way you hold it carefully because you're afraid to believe it fully. Actually okay. Solidly okay. The kind of okay that doesn't need anyone to confirm it. I don't know what comes next. I don't know what Kara eventually becomes to me, or what my parents and I build together over the coming years, or whether the relationships reshaped by these 10 days of reckoning grow into something worth having. I don't know if I'll fall in love again, or what that person will be like, or whether I will be different in that love than I was before, more guarded, or surprisingly more open, the way people sometimes are after they have survived something that should have made them close. I know that I run the same route on Tuesday and Thursday mornings that I have run for 3 years. I know there is a coffee shop at the end of it, with a table by the window that I think of as mine, though I have no claim to it, and someone else sits there often enough that I've had to make peace with that. I know that when the table is empty, I sit down and order the same thing and open whatever I'm reading and spend 40 minutes in the particular contentment of a life that asks nothing of me in that moment, except to be present in it. I know that is enough. I know that is more than enough. I know that Kara had counted on me falling apart. She had watched me for 27 years and decided she knew exactly how this story would end. She was wrong, and I built the proof of that, quietly, over 4 years. One ordinary day at a time. Not for her, not against her. Not to prove anything to anyone watching. Just because I could. Just because I was still here. Just because the life I was building, even in the darkest stretch of the building, was genuinely, stubbornly, irreducibly mine. That is where I stand. That is how this story ends. Thank you for being here for all 10 chapters. If this story stayed with you, if you heard something in Maya's voice that felt familiar, you know what to do. Leave your city and your local time in the comments. I read every single one. And if you've ever been written out of your own story by someone who was supposed to love you, I hope this reminded you that the pen was always yours.